Okay, so to continue our discussion of logic, we are going to look into the concepts of necessary and sufficient conditions. So, why do we have to talk about necessary and sufficient conditions in a class that's mainly on ethics? Well, it's because necessary and sufficient conditions become a big part of the moral theorizing that we do. So for instance, philosophers like to ask questions like, what is necessary for doing the right thing? Which basically means, what do you have to do in order to have done right? Is there something that's like in common between all of the morally good actions? They also ask the question, what is sufficient for moral rightness? This is a slightly different question. It asks, are there any conditions that guarantee that you've done the right thing? Because the necessary condition, say the thing that all the morally right actions have in common, might not be the same thing as an action, all of those of which are morally right. Now it's interesting, when we put these concepts together, and we'll see why as we work through these concepts, when we look at the question, what is necessary and sufficient for moral rightness, then we're giving a theory of what features are shared by all and only right actions. So let's dig into these concepts. And I think that hopefully we can see that because we're trying to get these ideas of what guarantees the quality of moral rightness, or what our preconditions for having done the morally right thing are, that these are important skills to pick up when we study ethics. So here are our definitions. A sufficient condition is a guarantee, right? If you think about the word sufficient, you realize that it basically means enough, right? So when we say that a sufficient condition is a guarantee, we're saying that if X is sufficient for Y, we're saying that having the quality of X guarantees that you have another quality. So for instance, we can say that being a human is sufficient for being a mammal. That is to say, you meet somebody, Bob, you know that Bob is a human, and with that information, you have enough information to also guarantee that Bob is also a mammal, right? Now, let's get that separate from the concept of a necessary condition. So a necessary condition is a requirement or a precondition or an inevitable consequence. So, for instance, we might say that getting a Bachelor of Arts degree is a necessary condition for studying for a Master's of Arts degree, right? But notice that when we say that getting a bachelor's is necessary for studying for a master's, we're not saying that a bachelor's degree guarantees that you will study for a master's, right? Many people get their bachelor's degree and say, that's enough school for me, I'm going to go get into the workforce, right? But we are saying that everybody who does study for that MA is going to get their BA first, right? Here's another one. Oxygen is a precondition, so you could also say is a necessary condition for starting a fire. What are we saying? We're saying that if a fire is started, then there must have been oxygen there beforehand, or another way of putting that is oxygen has to be there in order for a fire to start. Now again, we're saying that this is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. So oxygen is not a guarantee of fire, right? Because, there's oxygen in this room right now. There's oxygen in the room that you're in right now, hopefully. But also, hopefully, it's not on fire, right? So this is the important difference between a necessary condition a necessary condition on the one hand, a precondition, and a sufficient condition, a guarantee, on the other hand. So let's think about some examples. So one, being a car is a sufficient condition for being a vehicle. So the thing to keep in mind is it better to think about this in terms of a precondition, in which case we're stating a necessary condition, or a guarantee, which is a sufficient condition. So if we look at 1 and 2, one of these statements is true and the other one is false, right? Try to think this through, right? You can say all cars are vehicles, but not all vehicles are cars, right? Some vehicles are trucks or vans, right? Well, I guess what that's saying is that if you have a car, that guarantees you have a vehicle, but you don't have to have a car in order to own a vehicle, right? So you could own a van to own a vehicle. So then we would say, look, 2 is false, right? Being a car is not necessary for being a vehicle, but being a car is sufficient, that is, a guarantee for something's being a vehicle. Being a dog is a sufficient condition, or let me see being a vehicle is a sufficient condition for being a car. Sorry, I jumped ahead on my list there. Yeah. Being a vehicle is a sufficient condition for being a car. And what are we saying here? We're saying that if you have a vehicle, does that guarantee you have a car? Being a vehicle is a necessary condition for being a car. When we think about it this way, we flip them around, right? We can deny 3, right? Because just because you own a vehicle doesn't necessarily mean you own a car. You might own a van, you might own a motorcycle. Being a vehicle is not, but it is a necessary condition for being a car. That is to say, if you own a car, you're also going to have to own a vehicle. Basically, vehicleness comes along with carness, right? So here's how we might think about it. The necessary condition is a precondition or an inevitable consequence of another condition. So if we say x is necessary for y, it means that any time you have y, then x is also true, right? But if we say x is sufficient for y, it means that any time it's true that x, y also has to be true, right? So it's sort of the mirror image of the other, right? So what we're saying here is x is sufficient for y. We're saying that whenever you have x, you're going to also have y. We say that x is necessary for y. It means whenever you have y, x must have already been the case. Let's try a few more. Being unmarried is necessary for being a bachelor. Being unmarried is sufficient for being a bachelor. Which one's the true one and which one's the false one here? Well, we'd have to start thinking about how the concept of being unmarried fits in with being a bachelor, right? So we know that all bachelors are unmarried people, right? But not all unmarried people are bachelors, right? Because women, for instance, are unmarried, but they're not bachelors. So that's going to show us that the second one is false, right? Because being unmarried does not guarantee that you're a bachelor, but being unmarried is necessary, that is, a precondition for being a bachelor. Let's look at this pair. Being a dog is sufficient for being a mammal. Being a dog is necessary for being a mammal. Well, we're saying that some of the mammals are dogs, but not all of them. So we would actually say that this fourth one, being a dog is necessary for being a mammal isn't right. Because, there are other ways to be a mammal, like to be a human or to be a cat, right? So being a dog is not a precondition for being a mammal, but it is sufficient. If you are a dog, if you could be so lucky, then that guarantees, remember, sufficient means guarantee, of counting as a mammal. Here's an interesting pair. Being an unmarried man is sufficient for being a bachelor. Being an unmarried man is necessary for being a bachelor. Now, interestingly here, some people think that the definition of the concept of bachelor just means unmarried man, right? So then we say, if you're an unmarried man, that's a guarantee that you are a bachelor. But we can also say being an unmarried man is necessary for being a bachelor, right? So there we're saying, if you don't have the quality of being an unmarried man, you're not going to meet the preconditions for counting as a bachelor. So if that line of thinking is right, then actually being an unmarried man is a necessary and sufficient condition for being a bachelor. If we look at the earlier ones, right, you can think of a Venn diagram, those categories, right? We would say like smaller category, dog, fits fully inside the bigger category, mammal, right? So you've got the dog category within the mammal category, fully contained, right? And we're going to say that, like, if you fall into the smaller category, dog, that's going to be sufficient for being the larger category, being a member of the larger category as well, right? Now, when you have conditions that are necessary and sufficient for each other, those categories are going to overlap perfectly. So the unmarried man category is going to overlap perfectly with the bachelor category. Now, it gets interesting here because, some people might say that actually unmarried man, that concept, is actually separable from our concept of being a bachelor. So, for instance, they might say that, how would I put this? That there are some unmarried men who do not count as bachelors. And you might think of, say, widowers, or people who are celibate by choice, say, members of the priesthood. It would be weird to call them bachelors, but and so we might think that those categories come apart. And if that's right, then being an unmarried man might be necessary for being a bachelor still, but it's not a guarantee. So that's to say, all the bachelors are unmarried men, yes, but if widowers and members of the priesthood do not count as bachelors, then being an unmarried man is not sufficient. That is not a guarantee of being a bachelor. One last one, having a daughter is sufficient for being a parent. Having a daughter is necessary for being a parent. One of these sentences is true, one of these sentences is false. So we'd have to think this through, right? Well, we'd say, look, everybody who has a daughter is a parent, right? But not every parent has a daughter, right? Some parents, actually, like my parents, only have sons, right? So then we would say, yeah, having a daughter is sufficient. That is enough to guarantee that you're a parent. But it's not a necessary condition for being a parent because some parents only have sons. So that's what we need to get clear on when we talk about necessary and sufficient conditions. So just to recap, if X is a sufficient condition for Y, that means whenever X is true, Y is guaranteed to be true. Just to play with the Venn diagram one more time, we've got the smaller category and the bigger category. Falling into the category, let's say the smaller category is dogs and the larger category is mammal, right? We would say that X, being a dog, is sufficient for Y because it means that whenever you count as a dog, you're also going to count as a mammal, right? So we would say that being a dog is sufficient for being a mammal. But if we say that X is a necessary condition for Y, we're saying that it means that whenever Y is true, X also has to be true. So we could actually use the same Venn diagram, right? So we would put dog right here, and we would put mammal here, and we could say that being a mammal is a necessary condition for being a dog. So we flipped what's going into X and Y, right? So in that case, we would say that we've got counting as a mammal is a precondition for counting as a dog. Or at least you could say it's an inevitable consequence of counting as a dog. And then when we were thinking about that concept of bachelor and unmarried man, right, if these two concepts are really necessary and sufficient for each other, then you're going to have a perfect overlap, right? In that case, there's going to be no cases where they don't go together perfectly. So that's the basics of what you need to know about necessary and sufficient conditions.